My experiment video was trying to recreate the step printing effect digitally. Step printing is duplication of a film frame, and when you duplicate multiple frames in a sequence, you stretch out the sequence, creating slow motion. I will be experimenting by comparing different frame rates, shutter speeds, and different scenes to see which one works best to portray this effect digitally. A good example of this is the title sequence for Reservoir Dogs, where Tarantino used this effect to play each frame 3 times in a sequence, which, as you can see, creates slow motion. But what inspired this experiment more are the films of Wong Kar-wai, who uses step printing in the majority of his films. He uses it to create the sense that the characters are fish out of water and lost and lonely in an overcrowded world. Before knowing how to do it digitally, I had to know how step printing was done traditionally, and by watching interviews with Wong Kar-wai, I found it's done by shooting at a low frame rate, around 6 or 8 FPS, and they would use an optical printer to reprint the individual frames 3 or 4 times, which would then bring it back to 24 frames per second. For example, this scene here was shot at 6 frames per second, so the camera is undercranked, which is where you make the frame rate lower than the normal, which is around 24 frames per second. But normally when you undercrank, it creates fast motion and makes the scenes look faster and more dangerous according to the filmmaker's handbook. But with the 6 frames per second, Wong Kar-wai would then reprint with the optical printer and play each frame 4 times, which would then bring it back to 24 frames per second and would create slow motion because the sequence has been dragged out and only plays 6 frames per second, as you can see from this section of film how it would look. But also he would have a low shutter speed at around 1/12 of a second, which would create this smearing effect, because a low shutter speed means the sensor or the film is exposed for a longer time, so any movement across the camera creates this smearing effect, which is motion blur. You still get some motion blur shooting at a normal shutter speed, which is normally half the frame rate, so around 1/50 of a second. And this is because audiences are comfortable with a little motion blur. But shooting lower exaggerates the motion blur and creates this smearing effect, which Wong Kar-wai uses to make this lost feeling for his characters. So practically, when doing this digitally, I know I would have to use a camera which would be able to get low shutter speeds of around 1/6 and 1/12 of a second, which would create motion blur. And I would also need a camera which can be undercranked to 6 or 12 frames per second, because they're the frame rates I want to experiment with. But this isn't enough, because in theory, if you played this footage back, it would play back at 24 frames per second, which would create fast motion. So then with this, I would have to put it in Premiere and then slow the sequence down by, if I was shooting at 6 frames per second, I would slow it down by 25%, which would then get it back to 6 frames per second. And if I was doing 12 frames per second, I would then have to slow it down 50% to get back to normal speed. And this would have created the step printing effect, but this wasn't possible. And after the experimentation video, I explained how I achieved step printing digitally. To do this experiment, I wanted to get a camera which had the capability to have a low frame rate, but no cameras at the kit store had this, so I at least wanted a camera which was able to get slow shutter speed. So I chose the Canon C100 because it had changeable shutter speeds, and the two I experimented with were 1/6 and 1/12 of a second, so I could see the difference between the two and see which made the better motion blur and smearing effect in the video. The lens I used was a 135mm because firstly it links to the reference more, and it meant the frame wasn't super wide, meaning that the subjects were still fully in frame, meaning we could see all their actions, but also enough space around them to allow the audiences to see the movement going past them. But if I shot this with a wide, there would be too much space around them, taking the focus away from the subjects, which isn't what I wanted. I also used the 35mm wide lens for the following scenes where I'm following the subject, because it meant I could follow the subject but also see the world around him, which is what I wanted, because with this step printing effect you want to see the trails and the lights and the motion blur of the people around the subject. So when having a wide, when shooting, following someone, you never lose them out of the frame, but you still capture everything around them in the frame. But because no cameras had a changeable frame rate, I had to do step printing digitally. And to do this, I would put the clip in Premiere, and then I would have to cut the sequence frame by frame, then separate the frames so in between I could put the duplicated frames. So for example, the clips with 6 frames per second, I would cut them up and then move the rest of the sequence so there was a 3-frame gap in between each frame, and then I would copy and paste the same first 3 frames into the space, and then this would create 6 frames per second because you have 6 frames playing 4 times in a second, which means it's essentially playing 24 frames a second. This process of cutting and remaking the sequence took about an hour on each clip, and that's how I achieved step printing and created this effect and created the slow motion and motion blur. I think the effect came out well, and I did manage to achieve step printing digitally, because if you look at the clips you can see that it is slow motion but by undercranking, and this was all achieved with the cutting and pasting in Premiere and replaying the frames. And if you compare it to the reference of Wong Kar-wai, they do look very similar, and I'm happy with that because I did manage to recreate it all digitally. And for the first scene, I think 1/12 shutter speed worked best because I didn't have a tripod when filming, so when I was shooting at 1/6, the motion blur from my hand shaking created too much motion blur on the subject. I mean that trying to concentrate on the subjects was harder and more jarring for the audience. But when on 1/12, the subjects are more clear and the feeling of being fish out of water is clearer, which is what I was trying to achieve. Also for the first scenes I used 6 FPS compared to the last scenes which I used 12, which meant doubling each frame. I think they both work well, but I prefer 6 FPS because the more frames you add, the heavier the strobing and the jittiness becomes. But also for the last scenes you still get slow-mo, but it's not as good as 6 FPS in my opinion. But with the clips with 12 FPS, they were a lot clearer because I put the camera on a flat surface and filmed, not in my hand. So when you look at the clips with 1/6 shutter speed and 12 FPS, there isn't any motion from my hand, which makes the clip a lot better. So for the next time, if shooting a scene like this, I would do 6 FPS with 1/6 shutter speed with a tripod. Because with these settings, in my opinion, I think you get the best step printing effects because you have a lot of motion blur from the slow shutter speed, and the low frame rate means the strobiness and the jittiness are captured while also capturing the subjects clearly, like Wong Kar-wai does. For the following chase scenes, I think 1/12 shutter speed works best and came out the best because it's easier to watch. When doing this kind of scene on a low shutter speed of 1/6, the motion nearly becomes too much and hard to watch because the camera's moving, me holding the camera moving, and the subject's moving, and it just overpowers the scene, I think, and it makes it lesser to what you're trying to achieve. So a higher shutter speed of around 1/12 works better for this scenario. But using step printing in a scene like this works very well, I think. And say if you use this in a film, the effect it would have on the audience in the right context would be great, and would create an interesting atmosphere for the film. What also worked well is how I tackled the light, because when shooting on such a low shutter speed, the sensor is exposed to light for a long time, so the image can come out overexposed. And to tackle this, I would have to close the iris, but sometimes the image was still overexposed, so at some points I had to lower the gain, so the sensor on the camera was less sensitive to the light, so the image wasn't overexposed when it came out. This is why I didn't color grade the clip, so you could see how the image can be affected by the low shutter speed. I enjoy trying to achieve step printing digitally because I love the scenes of Wong Kar-wai films where he would do the effect, and now I know how to achieve it as well, and I will surely use it in my next film. And it was nice to learn how to create such an effect just by using the camera and some tools in Premiere. And I think doing this experiment also improved my camera skills, because when I was shooting these scenes, it was multiple scenarios with multiple different settings, and I had to rely on the crowds as well, so I had to be quick when filming. So this allowed me to know how to use the camera under pressure, so when I have to use it again in this style, I'll be ready with the skills. And it also taught me a lot about how frame rates and shutter speeds can affect the image. And if I were to do it again, I would definitely use a tripod, but I would also try and get the lens which had a smaller f-stop, because the lenses I had an f-stop of around 2.0 speed, which is normal. And if I was shooting at with a smaller f-stop, I would have a greater depth. I would have a more shallower depth of field, which would be nice because it means the subjects would be nice and sharp, but the motion around them would be out of focus, enhancing the feeling of fish out of water more. And to develop my skills further in something like this, I would try step printing with a camera that is capable of shooting at 6 FPS, and try and get this effect by using the camera solely.